You're still afraid, not of anything specific necessarily, not the way you were at 23, when the fear had edges and a name and showed up at predictable times. This fear is quieter, more ambient. It's the feeling you get before you make a phone call you've been putting off for 2 weeks, before you commit to something that requires you to be seen attempting it, before you say the thing that changes the room. It's the feeling that lives in the half second before every decision that actually matters. And what's remarkable, what I find genuinely fascinating, is that you have been living inside that feeling for decades now, and you have learned with extraordinary efficiency to call it something else. You call it being careful, being realistic, being responsible. You have rebranded fear so successfully that you no longer recognize it in yourself. Here's what I know about fear. After 40, it's not stronger. If anything, it's a thinner version of what it was at 20. The actual fear object, the failure, the humiliation, the judgment, you've already encountered most of the variants by now. You've survived the versions you were most afraid of. The thing that should have reduced the fear is that you now have evidence. Direct, personal, irrefutable evidence that you survived the things you were certain would undo you. You did not come undone. You are annoyingly still here, and yet the fear persists. Why? Because fear was never really about the threat. Fear was always about the story you told yourself about the threat. And stories don't die just because reality disproves them. They just get quieter, more polished, better disguised in the vocabulary of maturity and caution and wisdom. The mindset that kills fear after 40 doesn't require courage. It requires something much more specific. And I think you already know what it is. Let me trace this carefully, because the anatomy of fear after 40 is more precise than people acknowledge. And precision is the beginning of the solution. At 20, fear was mostly prospective. It lived in the future, what might happen, what you might lose, what they might think. You hadn't yet accumulated enough experience with outcomes to know how the feared thing would actually feel when it arrived. So fear had enormous operating room. It could fill the entire space between decision and consequence with speculation span. And speculation is always worse than reality because reality has edges and speculation doesn't. Something changed around your late 30s. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the inventory started filling in. You experienced failure, not the abstract concept of failure, actual failure, with its specific, finite, survivable texture. You experienced humiliation that you thought would be catastrophic and turned out to be, in the long run, information. You experienced relationships ending, projects dying, bets not paying out, people not arriving, systems revealing themselves to be exactly as unreliable as a part of you that wasn't afraid, always suspected. You accumulated evidence. And here is the part I find most interesting. The evidence didn't reduce the fear the way it should have, because you never updated the underlying story. You had the experience, you survived the experience, and then you filed the experience in the memory without revising the prediction model. The prediction model, the one that says the feared outcome will be unmanageable, was never actually compared to the evidence. It was just maintained. You know what I've noticed? No. Let me put this differently. I knew a man who had survived an extraordinary amount of darkness by the time he was 40. Real darkness. Losses that would end in most people, and what I found genuinely extraordinary was that his fear of new losses was, if anything, larger after the accumulation than before it, because the story he'd built was not, I survived all of that, therefore I can survive more. The story was, each of those things cost me enormously, and the next one might be the one I don't come back from. He had converted every piece of evidence of his own resilience into evidence of his vulnerability. I thought that was one of the more creative things I'd ever seen a human mind do to itself. Here's what the internal dialogue actually sounds like at 40-something when fear arrives. You think, I know how this ends. You think, I've been here before and it didn't go the way I hoped, which is evidence that it won't go the way I hope now. You think, I'm not 23 anymore. I can't afford the kind of setback this might produce. You think, other people at my stage have made peace with their limitations, and maybe the reason they seem more at peace is because they stopped trying things that could fail. You think, the fear itself is trying to tell me something, and wisdom is listening to it. That last thought is the one that does the most damage. Because it reframes fear as intelligence. It makes the avoidance feel not like fear, but like discernment. The cage gets lined with velvet and called a choice. Here's what's actually happening. The fear is not measuring the real risk. It is measuring the story about the risk. And the story about the risk is decades old and has not been updated once since it was installed, despite the fact that you now have extensive evidence about your actual capacity to survive things, which the story completely ignores, because stories, unlike intelligence, are not interested in evidence that contradicts them. There's also the specific problem of what failure means at 40 compared to what it meant at 20. At T, when failure was temporary by definition, there was enough time ahead that even serious setbacks could be recovered from. And everyone around you understood that you were still in the experimental phase. At 40, failure feels more permanent. Not because it genuinely isn't, but because the cultural story about 40 has no experimental phase. The culture has decided you should know better by now. And the fear of being someone who should know better, but tried something and failed anyway, is a specific, expensive, largely invented form of shame. So here is the actual question. Not the soft version, if you already know, from direct evidence, that you survive the things you fear. What exactly are you protecting yourself from? 5 points, built like a demolition, delivered like an observation. Wisdom, that's the word. That's the word that fear has been hiding inside for the last decade of your life. Caution gets called wisdom. Avoidance gets called discernment. Hesitation gets called perspective. And the brilliant thing about this particular rebranding is that it makes fear sound like an achievement. Like you've earned the right to be afraid through the sheer accumulation of experience. As though the more you've seen, the more reason you have to stop moving, when any honest reading of experience says the opposite. Wisdom is accurate pattern recognition applied to current decisions. It uses the past as data. It says, here's what I've learned from what happened, and here's how that learning applies to this specific situation. It is forward-looking, specific, and calibrated to reality. Fear is not wisdom. Fear is an old prediction run on current data and producing the same output regardless of the input. It says, here is how this might go wrong, with the implicit assumption that how it might go wrong is more important than what evidence suggests about how it's likely to go. Wisdom and fear can look identical from the outside. Both can produce hesitation. Both can produce caution. But their internal mechanics are completely different. And the way to tell them apart is to ask, am I working from evidence or from a story about what evidence means? Real wisdom is the least afraid thing in the room. Fear wearing wisdom's outfit is the most afraid thing in the room, while being completely convinced it's the most rational. Fear after 40 has a very specific genealogy, and it didn't come from your experience. It came from the story you absorbed about what experience is supposed to produce. The dominant cultural narrative about aging says, implicitly but clearly, as you get older, the stakes get higher. The resources available to recover from failure get smaller. Then therefore the appropriate response to risk is increasing caution over time. This narrative is presented as natural, as the obvious conclusion of anyone who has lived long enough to understand how things work. It is, in fact, a specific story, told by specific interests, for specific reasons. The institutional preference for stability over disruption is served by a population that becomes more risk-averse with age. The financial industry benefits enormously from the idea that the older you are, the more you should protect what you have. The employment market benefits from workers who believe that their ability to recover from a failed bet diminishes with each year, because those workers are easier to retain and cheaper to manage. The social structures that depend on people staying in their lanes professionally, creatively, relationally, are served by fear being dressed as wisdom, because wisdom sounds like a choice and fear sounds like a problem. And people who are choosing are much more compliant than people who are afraid. Your fear is not a conclusion about your experience. It is a story about your experience that was delivered to you by systems that benefit from the story. There are people in your life who, when you express doubt or hesitation, immediately confirm it. They add to it. Yes, it is risky. Yes, at your age, the calculus is different. Yes, maybe wait a bit longer. Think it through a bit more. And they do this with the specific energy of people who are being helpful, who are on your side, who are offering the benefit of their own consideration of the risks involved. Examine that reflex. People who are genuinely fearless, and I mean this in the precise sense, not the performative sense, do not tend to confirm other people's fears. They tend to interrogate them. They ask, is this actually the risk you think it is? Or is this the story about the risk? They ask, what is the actual worst case? And what are the actual odds? They are interested in helping you make an accurate assessment. They are not interested in helping you feel validated in your avoidance. The people who confirm your fears are, almost always, confirming their own. Your expressed hesitation gives them permission to locate their own hesitation and call it collective wisdom rather than shared fear. You become the external evidence for the internal story they need maintained. And the most frustrating version of this is when the confirmation comes from people who love you because they are genuinely trying to protect you from the thing they themselves are afraid to do. I'll tell you something about fear and performance. I once knew someone who spent enormous time and energy looking fearless to exactly the audience who needed to believe it. Not actually fearless looking fearless. Very different. The performance was extraordinary. Completely convincing to everyone except the person delivering it. And the fear that performance was covering. Key. He fear of being found insufficient, of being seen as less than the role required, was, if anything, larger for being hidden. I found it instructive. Fear in performance costume is still fear. It's just more expensive to maintain. The people who need you to confirm your hesitation are not showing you wisdom. They are using your hesitation to authenticate their own. Here is what actually happens to fear after 40 when you stop feeding it with the story and start feeding it with accurate accounting. It shrinks, not dramatically, not overnight, not in a way that makes for an inspirational before and after. It shrinks the way water retreats from heat, slowly, steadily, across contact with the actual evidence of what you've survived. Because the fuel fear requires is uncertainty. It requires the gap between what might happen and what I know I can handle. And that gap narrows dramatically once you do the honest accounting of what you have already handled. You've survived failures that you were certain would be definitive. You've survived the end of relationships that you thought were structural to your survival. You've survived financial hits that seemed unsurvivable at the time and turned out to be temporarily terrible and eventually instructive. You've survived the judgment of people whose judgment you were certain would damage you, and it didn't, or it did, and you healed. You have, in 40-plus years of living, accumulated an extraordinary amount of direct evidence about your own capacity to survive things. The advantage of 40 is that the advantage of 40 is that the evidence exists. The disadvantage is that you haven't read it. The moment you actually read it, with the same rigor you apply to the stories about what might go wrong. Fear loses the operating room it requires to function. It can still exist, but it can no longer pretend to be the most intelligent thing in the room. Fear that has been audited is fear that has been demoted. Point 5, distinguish frozen from calibrated. There are two kinds of people who appear fearless at 40. They look identical from the outside, but they operate completely differently from the inside. The first kind has convinced themselves that fear doesn't apply to them. They move fast, decide quickly, refuse to acknowledge risk with any seriousness. And because they're not processing fear, they're also not processing the real information that fear contains. Because fear, at its core, before it becomes a story, is a signal. It is the nervous system's flag that something is at stake. The person who has suppressed that signal entirely has also suppressed the flag. They move fast and they run into walls that a more calibrated person would have seen. They confuse absence of fear with intelligence. The second kind has done the accounting. They know what the signal means in their own specific nervous system, in their own specific history, in the specific context of this specific decision. They can read fear the way you read weather, not as a command to stop, but as information about conditions. They ask, is this signal pointing at a real risk or at an old story? They do the check, and then they decide. That's the mindset. That's the one. Not fearlessness, fluency. The person who has developed fear fluency at 40 is not the person who stopped feeling it. It's the person who learned to translate it. 4 shifts. These change the operating architecture, not the surface behavior. The internal language of fear is very specific, and it does its most significant damage at the moment of decision. The half second before you commit or retreat, it sounds like, I'm not ready. I need more time. I should think about this more carefully. These phrases are architecturally identical to the phrases you would use if you were being genuinely cautious. They sound like intelligence. They feel like maturity. They are, almost always, fear in a clean jacket. Replace them. I'm not ready becomes, I have more information available right now than I have ever had at a decision point. What am I actually waiting for? I need more time becomes, I need to determine whether more time will produce more information or simply more opportunity for the story to reinstall itself. I should think about this more carefully becomes, I have been thinking about this. The question is whether the thinking is producing analysis or reinforcing avoidance. It's too risky becomes, what is the actual risk? Becomes, what is the actual risk? And how does it compare to the actual evidence of what I can handle? The goal of the replacement is not to eliminate caution. The goal is to force the fear to be specific. Vague fear has infinite power. Specific fear has a perimeter. Once it has a perimeter, you can work with it. Some of the environments you inhabit have a relationship to fear that you've been absorbing without noticing. The professional culture where risk is discussed only in terms of what could go wrong, never in terms of what could go right. The social circle where the dominant emotion around ambition is protective skepticism, where someone's enthusiastic commitment to something is met with a recitation of reasons it might not work. The media consumption that is calibrated toward worst-case scenarios because worst-case scenarios generate attention. The family environment where the language of safety and security has been the dominant emotional frequency for so long that any departure from it feels like ingratitude or recklessness. These environments are not making you smarter about fear. They are making fear louder. They are amplifying the story at the expense of the evidence. The audit is not about removing yourself from every environment that acknowledges risk. It is about identifying which environments treat fear as a conclusion versus which ones treat it as a data point. The first kind produces stasis. The second kind produces people who can actually move. Find more of the second kind. Spend more time there. Not to be told you can do it. To be in spaces where the question being asked is always what the evidence actually says rather than what the worst case might be. The next time fear presents itself, the next time the half-second pause arrives, the next time the quiet internal voice produces the not yet, the not sure, the maybe wait, you need 2 sentences. Internal, for the architecture of your own response. The first, this is a signal, not a sentence. The second, I have survived everything I was most afraid of. This is not the exception, not bold, not triumphant. Certain, the certainty of someone who has actually done the accounting and found the results internally consistent. Who knows? From direct evidence rather than from hope that the feared thing is manageable, because you have already managed it in one form or another, multiple times. This is not bravery. This is bookkeeping. The final shift is about the specific internal posture of someone who has made the decision that fear is no longer the final authority on their choices. This is not the same as deciding fear doesn't exist. It exists. It will continue to exist. It is a functional system built into you by evolution, and it has no interest in being eliminated. The ownership statement is not, I have eliminated my fear. The ownership statement is, fear is a member of the panel, not the chair. What this means in practice, fear gets heard. It gets asked what it's actually pointing at. Its signal gets translated and assessed. And then the decision is made by the full panel, which includes the evidence of what you've survived, the clarity about what you actually want, the assessment of what the actual, not imagined consequences of failure are. And fear's vote counts but does not determine the outcome. The person who has made this decision moves differently. Not faster, necessarily. Not more recklessly. More specifically. They are not trying to ignore the fear's signal. They are fluent in it. They know when it's pointing at something real and when it's maintaining a story. And the moment you can tell the difference, fear loses its veto power. This is the mindset. It doesn't arrive in a moment of inspiration. It is built slowly through the deliberate practice of asking the fear to be specific rather than simply obeying its general direction. You already have most of the material. You've been collecting it for 4 decades. The only remaining question is whether you're willing to actually read what you've accumulated. Here is what's actually happening at the level of the larger system. The culture of fear maintenance that you absorbed through institutions, through social norms, through the accumulated messaging of a world that runs better when its participants are risk-averse. That culture never updated its story about you. It built a model of you at 20 when fear was a reasonable tool for limiting costly experiments, and it has been running that model ever since. The model says, this person is afraid of failure, and that fear keeps them productive and compliant and inside the arrangement. And for a long time, the model was approximately accurate. But something happened. You accumulated evidence, real, direct, undeniable evidence, that the things you feared were survivable, that the failures were finite, that the judgments were temporary, that the worst outcomes were bad but not catastrophic. And most of the outcomes you feared didn't even happen. You became without the call. Luxure ever acknowledging it. Someone with a track record. Someone who has data. Someone who is, in the most literal sense of the phrase, no longer operating from theory. The culture's model of you is 20 years out of date. It is running a program that no longer corresponds to the actual person. And the gap between what the program predicts and what you've actually demonstrated about your own resilience is where fear goes to die, if you let it. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You are the most evidence-rich version of yourself that has ever existed. Every fear you've managed, every failure you've survived, every judgment you've weathered and continued, all of it is available to you as operating information, not as inspiration, not as encouragement, as data. Cold, accurate, empirical data about what you can handle. The person who reads that data clearly is not fearless. They are something better, calibrated. They know which signals are real and which are stories. They know, not from hope but from history, that the range of outcomes on the other side of a hard decision is finite and survivable. They move with the specific ease of someone who has done the math and found the results reasonable. That person is not a future version of you. That person is not a future version of you. They are the version you've been accumulating evidence to become for 40 years. The only variable remaining is whether you're willing to actually read the file. Fear doesn't die after 40 because you get braver. Fear dies after 40 because you finally have enough evidence to stop believing the story. The evidence has been in the file the entire time. Read it.